Hey everyone, Christina here. Today I want to talk about some things I do in my garden that might be considered unconventional. These are things that go against a lot of what you read and hear about gardening, but they work great for me, and I'm going to pass them along and maybe they'll work great for you as well. The first thing I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about 3 different vegetables in my garden. The first one is tomatoes. So, conventional wisdom has it that you must prune them if you want a good harvest. But when I started growing tomatoes, in my inexperience, I just bought a store-bought tomato plant and I threw it in the ground and I never pruned it. Then years later, I read, oh, prune, 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 you'll get a better harvest, so I started doing that. But what I discovered was, didn't matter what variety I was growing, pruning didn't seemed to help my yields. I would keep pretty good track of what I would get off my plants, and it didn't make a difference. In fact, a lot of times it seemed to reduce my harvest. So I went back to doing it my way. And years later, I read a book called Epic Tomatoes, which I highly recommend. I wish I could remember the author's name, but it's not coming to mind. I'll put a link in the description. You should read it if you grow tomatoes. The author he knows his stuff, he's works for Seed Savers Exchange, and he's trialed over 1,000, maybe a couple thousand at this point, tomatoes, and created new varieties and things like that. And he talks about the myth of pruning. And he explains that if you're pruning your tomato plant, you are actually decreasing the chances of getting mature fruit. Makes sense, right? It's a myth that suckers are somehow going to delay ripening or fruiting or flowering. It's just not fact. It's, some myth that somebody felt that was the case, and somehow it's spread throughout the internet, and now a lot of people believe it. So actually, if you go ahead and let those suckers grow, you're going to have more chances for fruit to ripen. And if your tomatoes are grown outside, these at least are in the greenhouse, so it's not an issue, but if you're outside and you live where there is a really hot summer, having more foliage is going to help protect the fruit from sun scald. So there can be benefits aside from how much you harvest from your plant. So the only time that you ever need to prune, well, this year I did something a little different, not because I've had issues with diseases, but I just thought, that's probably a good practice, as when I planted my seedlings and they got, so high, I took the branches that were touching the ground, where the leaves were touching the ground, and I just popped those off. I just thought it was a good idea because that's where moisture and other things can cause disease. But the only other time you're going to want to prune is if you have an indeterminate variety, so that's the kind that goes vining and tries to take over the world, and it's too big. You can go ahead and prune it to keep the size controllable. You can also prune if you like to make it a little easier to get to the fruit. If you have a really big plant, I could see where you might want to do that. But as far as pruning in order to get higher yields of fruit, nah, not in my experience, and not in the experience of many experts. So give it a try. It saves a lot of time not to have to do that. So the second plant I want to talk to you about today is garlic. I've already pulled mine, so it's in my greenhouse kind of curing before I bring it into the house. But let me tell you a story about it. So when we first moved here, I had experience growing garlic, but the particular garlic we had here, I didn't know exactly what variety it was because it was in the ground and the previous owners didn't tell us. But my in-laws, my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law, both appeared to have the same variety. And theirs did so much better. And what did I do differently? Well, I was following the rules about how to grow garlic. So when the garlic would shoot up a flower stalk, like this, we call it a scape, right? The conventional thing to do is to chop that off. And the idea is that if you cut that off, then the plant isn't sending energy to the flower in order to produce seeds, and therefore your bulbets are going to be bigger. So the part of the garlic that you traditionally use is going to be bigger. So I was doing this, and when I would dig up my garlic, it would be smaller than probably what you would typically buy at the grocery store. So this year, after talking to my in-laws who said, oh, we just put it in the ground and do nothing to it until we're ready to harvest it, I let the scapes grow, the flower stalks. I let that flower, and when the leaves started to turn yellow or were nicely yellow, I usually wait for the bottom 2 or 3 to get yellow, I harvested. And lo and behold, I got big old garlic. Look at that. It's as big as my hand. Huge difference. Why? I can't tell you. I just know that it works. So if you're having trouble with your garlic and aren't satisfied with your bulbs, then I would suggest you try not cutting down the scapes. I know it goes against convention. I know I even produced a video about how important it is to cut off your scapes if you want to have big garlic heads, but at least in this instance with this variety, which is obviously like an elephant garlic, I think, but it didn't look like an elephant garlic when I had the scapes cut off. And this was true for everything that I harvested this year. I don't think it's a coincidence because of my in-laws' experience. So sometimes what everybody thinks they know, they don't. It applies to gardening as well as a lot of other things in life. Now let's talk about potatoes. All right, so first let me give you a little history about my potatoes. It used to be, when we lived in the suburbs, I tried to grow large quantities of potatoes, and my best results actually came from these grow bags. But when we moved out into a rural area, my diet drastically changed. I eat low carb now because I'm diabetic. In fact, you can watch a video about how I reversed my diabetes, going from needing insulin to having totally normal blood sugar strictly through diet. I'll put the link in the description. Nevertheless, I like to grow a few potatoes so that my husband and children once in a while can have them. They try not to eat them too much because, of course, they're high risk for diabetes as well. So, but this year with COVID, I thought, maybe this year I should try a little harder to grow more potatoes. So I deviated from what I normally do. Typically, I have an area behind my greenhouse where I also have Jerusalem artichokes growing, and all I do is stick potatoes in the ground and let them grow. I do not hill them. That means I don't push dirt up the stems as the plants grow. That's typically what is recommended for a good potato yield. And I always get plenty for what we want. And this year, though, I decided, I better do it the right way. And I hilled my potatoes. So I did grow some behind the greenhouse, but I've already harvested those. I have this one grow bag that I haven't harvested yet. So you can see it's pretty much died back. It's about ready for harvest. I'm going to harvest it today or maybe in a few days. But what I found from my other grow bags and also from the potatoes that I grew behind the greenhouse was that hilling did a horrible job. I hardly got any potatoes, and the ones I got were very small. I mean, they'll get eaten, but it wasn't what I had in mind at all, and it was a lot more work. So I want to clarify that sometimes with potatoes, you'll get tons of greens, you know, the leaves, and they'll grow big, and then nothing is really happening below the soil. And that typically happens because there's too much nitrogen in the soil. That was not really the case here. These, as you can see, they didn't grow very tall and not abundantly green. So this was not a case of too much nitrogen in the soil. And in fact, I use the same exact soil that I've used elsewhere in my garden and not seen that it was high in nitrogen. I tested the soil, it wasn't high in nitrogen. So it wasn't a matter of nutrients in the soil, it was a matter of method. And I have discovered this is true no matter what kind of potatoes I have tried to grow. So if you're having rotten potato yields, I would like to suggest to you that you try not hilling at least some of your potatoes and see if they do better, because for me, that's sure what happens. Well, I hope this has helped you. Beyond the specific sort of instructions I've given regarding tomatoes, garlic, and potatoes, I hope that you'll see the bigger picture. And whenever you're having trouble with anything in life, but specifically in the garden, I hope you'll think outside the box. Experiment. See what works for you. There are so many variables in gardening, whether it's the weather, and your neighbor can have different weather than you. You might have a different microclimate, or your soil, or the variety you're using. Experimentation is key. So if you're afraid to not have an abundant crop of, green beans or whatever it is that you're growing one year, and you don't want to, completely lose the chance to have that crop, go ahead and just take a small section of your garden and use it for your experiments, trying a different variety, trying a different growing method, whatever. That's actually better than, changing up the whole garden, because then you can see side by side, did this method or this variety or whatever the case might be actually produce better results than the way I have been doing it or the way that is conventional to do it. All right, if you have questions, please leave a comment. I am really just doing this to help people. If you like what you see, I hope you'll subscribe and check out the blog and all that good stuff too. I'll see you next time. Bye.